Her sister locked the heavy iron doors of the royal bedchamber from the outside, the malicious laughter fading down the freezing stone corridor. "Enjoy your execution, Seren," Freya whispered through the narrow iron grate. Seren was trapped in the private rooms of the Beast of the North, and soon she would hear the heavy metallic click of his boots. The grand royal fortress of Thornmere was a colossal monument carved from ancient sorrow, a looming citadel wrapped entirely in dense fog and perpetual winter frost. The massive granite walls seemed to breathe ice, creating an atmosphere that crushed the weak and elevated only the most brutal of predators. It was a place where mercy was considered a fatal flaw, and survival required a constant, exhausting vigilance. Seren had spent her entire life mastering the painful art of being invisible within these hostile halls. She was an outcast, the unacknowledged half-blood of the high-ranking noble house, forced into grueling servitude while her legitimate sister draped herself in crimson silk gowns and unearned privilege. A girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced, because she was never there to begin with. That solitary, desolate truth had been her shield. That had been her only method of survival. Instead, it became the moment Seren Vantrell's entire world shattered. The betrayal had begun precisely an hour earlier, down in the stifling smoke-filled heat of the lower kitchens. Seren had been on her hands and knees, rhythmically scrubbing the soot-stained hearths with a coarse brush. Her fingers were raw, the calluses split and bleeding from the lye and harsh soap. The physical labor was a constant, somatic ache that grounded her, a pain she understood and could manage. It was far easier to bear than the quiet, agonizing emptiness that plagued her chest. But the fragile peace of her isolation was abruptly broken when Freya appeared in the doorway. The noblewoman smelled strongly of sweet gardenia, a cloying, expensive perfume that utterly failed to mask the underlying scent of calculated, venomous rot. Freya wore an exquisite, heavy cloak of pristine white fox fur, the luxurious garment contrasting violently with the dark ash staining the servant girl's tattered wool dress. Her golden hair was pinned up in an intricate crown of braids, showcasing a neck draped in heavy silver jewelry bought with the sweat and exhaustion of Omegas like the one kneeling before her. In perfectly manicured hand, with nails painted the color of fresh blood, she held a thick parchment sealed with dark red wax, a mock royal missive forged with deadly intent. "Take this to the royal sanctuary," Freya had commanded, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that made the hair on the back of the outcast's neck stand up. "Elder Brahman requires it placed directly on the high desk. It is a matter of urgent pack security. Do not dawdle, little sister, or the council will have you whipped in the courtyard for insubordination." Seren had hesitated, pushing a strand of soot-streaked silver hair out of her eyes. Her heart began hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. The upper levels were strictly forbidden territory. They housed the private sanctuary of Caline Valerius, the Alpha King of Thornmere. The laws of the pack were absolute, carved in blood and ancient bone over centuries of warfare. To cross the threshold of the king's bedchamber without his explicit, spoken invitation was an act of high treason. The punishment was not imprisonment, it was immediate, brutal execution, usually carried out by the king himself before the blood even had time to freeze on the courtyard stones. "I cannot," she had whispered, her voice rough and cracked from disuse. She kept her gaze respectfully lowered, staring at the polished toes of her half-sister's leather boots. "The guards. Garrick Stone patrols the lower stairs of that wing. He will not let me pass. He is fiercely loyal to the king's privacy. Garrick is stationed at the northern border gates tonight," the older woman replied flatly, her tone shifting from sweet to razor-sharp. Her eyes glinted with a dangerous, triumphant light. "The path is entirely clear. I checked it myself." "Do as you are told, Omega. Or shall I tell the elders you refused a direct command that jeopardizes the safety of the realm?" She had absolutely no choice. Refusal meant a public trial, and the ruling elders, especially the rigid and traditional Elder Bramon Kale, heavily favored the high-status nobles. He was easily manipulated by wealth, lineage, and political influence, remaining completely indifferent to the suffering of the lower ranks. If Freyr accused her of treason, the elders would not hesitate to sentence her to the freezing border, keeps to die of exposure. The subsequent climb up the winding stone stairs to the forbidden upper floors had been agonizing. The bitter, howling winter wind ripped through the narrow arrow slits in the heavy masonry, slicing through the servant's thin, threadbare garments like physical blades. Her bare feet slapped against the freezing granite steps, each movement sending a sharp, biting pain shooting up her calves, while her crescent-claiming mark throbbed with a strange, dull warning. She carried the heavy silver tray holding the missive with trembling hands, her knuckles turning white from the strain. The temperature plummeted drastically the higher she ascended, a dense, unnatural frost clinging to the stone walls. This was the residual elemental aura of the Alpha King himself, a devastating curse of endless winter that bled from his very soul, freezing anything that dared to approach his isolation. The air grew so thin and cold that every breath burned her lungs, frosting the edges of her silver hair. She did not know that her sister had shadowed her every single step, moving silently behind her in the shadows. When Seren finally reached the forbidding metal entrance of the royal bedchamber, the oppressive, heavy silence of the corridor pressed down on her chest like a physical weight. The dark metal was rimed with thick, jagged ice. She reached out, her fingers burning against the freezing steel handle, intending only to slide the missive under the narrow gap at the floorboards, and immediately retreat. Suddenly, a violent two-handed shove from behind sent her stumbling forward. The heavy doors groaned open on frozen hinges, and Seren fell hard onto the dark, polished obsidian floor of the forbidden sanctuary. The silver tray clattered loudly into the shadows, the parchment sliding away into the dark corners of the room. Before she could scramble backward to correct her footing, the massive iron doors slammed shut with a deafening, final resonance that shook the floorboards beneath her knees. The heavy, unmistakable scrape of metal turning in a lock echoed through the chamber. Freya had used the obsidian key. The heavy, black stone artifact was a sacred relic of the castle's original architects, a master key the noblewoman must have carefully stolen from the elder's vault to orchestrate this exact, lethal betrayal. Seren scrambled to her feet, throwing her entire body weight against the unyielding iron. "Freya!" she gasped, her breath blooming in thick white clouds of vapor against the metal. "Freya, please! Open the door! You cannot do this! You always were so terribly naive," the noblewoman mocked, her voice muffled but distinct through the thick metal. "The Alpha King returns tonight from the bloodiest skirmish on the northern front. He is feral, exhausted, and completely unforgiving. When he finds a trespassing rat defiling his sacred den, he will tear you apart without a second thought, and I will finally be rid of the pathetic stain on our family's pristine honor." "Please," the outcast pleaded, her voice breaking into a ragged whisper. She did not cry. Crying was a useless luxury she had unlearned years ago. Tears only froze on your cheeks in Thornmere. "They will know. The council will eventually find out you did this. You will be punished. The council will know only that a delusional, low-born maid tried to sneak into the king's bed to elevate her station and paid the ultimate price for her arrogance." Her half-sister sneered, her tone dripping with absolute satisfaction. "Enjoy your execution, Seren." The soft, retreating click of expensive leather heels faded down the corridor, leaving a silence so profound it felt like a physical entity wrapping its cold hands around her throat. She was completely alone, trapped in the dark, cold obsidian and steel bedchamber of the most feared sovereign in 3 realms. Seren pressed her spine against the frozen iron of the door, her chest heaving as blind panic clawed viciously at her throat. The chamber was massive, cavernous, and utterly devoid of any welcoming warmth. The air smelled intensely of sharp pine needles, deep winter frost, and the faint, coppery tang of old battle blood that lingered on the armor stands. There were no hearth fires lit in the enormous stone fireplace. The shadows pooled in the cavernous corners, like living, breathing entities, watching her every move. She had to get out. She had to escape before the formidable sovereign returned from the slaughter. Pushing herself off the floor, she began a frantic, desperate search of the perimeter. The cold was not merely an absence of heat in this forbidden room. It was an aggressive, predatory force. It bit sharply at her exposed ankles, sliding insidiously under the frayed hem of her tattered dress to gnaw at her trembling calves. It seeped deeply into her joints, turning the fluid to sludge, until every slight movement sent a shock of rigid, paralyzing pain through her delicate limbs. She ran her raw, calloused hands along the intricate, heavy wool tapestries that lined the eastern wall. The rough woven threads depicted ancient, bloody battles, massive silver wolves tearing ruthlessly through enemy ranks, a stark, visual reminder of the Valerius bloodline's legendary capacity for violence. She pushed the heavy fabric aside, frantically searching for a hidden latch, a forgotten servant's passage, a structural weakness in the mortar. Anything that might yield to her desperate fingers. But the dark masonry behind the tapestries was seamless, built perfectly to withstand a full-scale military siege. The architecture offered no mercy. She moved toward the colossal arched windows that overlooked the treacherous northern cliffs. The glass was incredibly thick, reinforced with heavy wrought iron bars that were masterfully forged into the shapes of snarling wolves. Outside the glass, a violent, screaming blizzard raged, entirely obscuring the jagged, deadly rocks thousands of feet below. Even if she possessed the strength to break the pane, the sheer drop would be instantly fatal. Desperation driving her beyond reason, she grabbed a heavy steel goblet from a nearby side table and slammed it against the frost-covered glass. The brutal impact sent a painful, vibrating shock up her arm, jarring her shoulder socket. The glass did not even scratch. She struck it again and again, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The dull metallic impacts were completely swallowed by the sheer immensity of the room. She dropped the goblet to the floor, her muscles screaming in protest, her hands shaking violently. There was absolutely no way out. The horrifying realization washed over her, chilling her far deeper than the ambient frost of the room. She stumbled backward, her legs finally giving out, and sank down onto the obsidian floor. She pulled her knees tightly to her chest, wrapping her thin arms around her shins in a futile, desperate attempt to conserve her rapidly fading body heat. The stories of Calin Valerius, that whispered constantly through the servants' quarters, were the stuff of visceral nightmares. No woman lasted a night with him, they had whispered, but one woman did. One woman lasted a lifetime. That was the mythical legend of the true fated mate, a romantic delusion the scullery maids clung to for comfort. The reality of the Alpha King was much darker and far more brutal. He was a cursed sovereign, his powerful soul encased in a violent, elemental ice that actively punished verbal intimacy and destroyed anyone who sought to manipulate or control him. He was a ruthless military commander who had personally executed traitors with his bare hands, leaving their bodies in the snow as a silent warning. He did not ask questions of intruders. He did not show mercy to trespassers. To find a low-status servant hiding in his most private sanctuary would instantly trigger his most lethal territorial instincts. As the temperature in the unlit room continued to drop, a strange, somatic reaction began deep within her chest. The crescent-claiming mark on her inner wrist began to pulse, throbbing in stark contrast to the ambient frost. The hollow mark didn't just contain her power, it created a void, an absence where her magic should be, waiting in agonizing silence for a true catalyst. Beneath the freezing numbness of her skin, a tiny, buried spark of warmth fluttered to life. It was a golden, molten heat, a remnant of a hidden solar lineage she did not fully understand, and had spent her entire miserable life suppressing. Her mother had warned her with her dying breath, never let them see the light. In a kingdom ruled by wolves and ice, fire was a dangerous anomaly. Fire invited death. She forced the golden warmth down, clamping her emotional shields, tight and biting her cracked lip until she tasted blood. She could not afford to lose control of her own body. She had to remain perfectly invisible. If she could just hide behind the heavy velvet drapes near the bed, perhaps she could slip out unnoticed when the king eventually opened the door. It was a fragile, desperate, impossible hope, but it was all she had left. She crawled toward the darkest corner of the room, wedging herself tightly tween the freezing stone wall and a massive oak wardrobe. The darkness eagerly swallowed her small frame. The physical toll of the extreme cold was immense. Her eyelashes were heavily coated in fine white frost. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, the sharp copper taste of her own blood grounding her in the miserable, inescapable reality of her situation. "We are small things in a world of teeth, my little one," her mother had once whispered in the dark. "Smallness is a gift, use it." Time completely lost its meaning. It could have been minutes or hours that she sat huddled there in the crushing dark, her pulse slowing dangerously as the freezing air seeped deeper into her blood. The silence in the royal chamber was absolute, heavy and terrifying. And then the domestic stillness was shattered. From the stone corridor outside, a sound cut sharply through the quiet. A heavy boot struck the frozen granite floor. Seren stopped breathing. Her entire body went completely rigid. Another heavy step echoed, followed by a terrifying, steady rhythm. It was the heavy, rhythmic impact of armored boots on the granite floor. The footfalls were slow, deliberate, and carried the immense, crushing weight of absolute authority. Each step sent a faint, terrifying vibration through the ancient walls, a resonance that traveled directly from the floorboards into her marrow. The ruthless warlord had returned. The heavy, overwhelming scent of a brewing winter storm, mixed with the sharp, unmistakable odor of fresh battlefield blood, seeped aggressively through the narrow gap beneath the iron doors. The atmosphere in the room instantly grew heavier, the air pressure dropping so sharply it made her ears pop. The frost on the walls seemed to thicken in response to his proximity, creeping across the obsidian floor in rapid, jagged, fractal patterns of white ice. She pressed herself harder against the wall, trying to merge with the stone, making herself as small as physically possible. She squeezed her eyes shut, her entire body trembling violently, utterly unable to control the somatic terror flooding her nervous system. The heavy footsteps stopped right outside the chamber door. For an agonizing, suspended second, there was absolutely nothing but the muffled sound of the raging blizzard outside the frosted windows. Then, the heavy, metallic scrape of a key sliding into the lock echoed through the room like a physical blow. The massive iron mechanism clicked with a horrifying finality. The heavy brass handle began to turn slowly downward, groaning against the thick ice that coated it. Seren clamped two freezing hands over her mouth to stifle a whimper, her heart hammering a frantic, doomed rhythm against her ribs. The ancient lunar seal on her wrist suddenly flared with a searing, burning heat that made her gasp silently into her palms. The massive steel barricade groaned open, and the cold deepened into a void. Calin Valerius, the Alpha King of Thornmere, stood perfectly still in the shadowed threshold. He was massive, dripping with fresh battle grime and thick winter frost, an apex predator walking into his den. His winter storm eyes instantly swept the darkness of his private sanctuary, detecting the subtle shift in the air. Seren collapsed further against the wall, her knees finally giving out in pure, paralyzing terror. She curled into a tight, trembling ball on the dark obsidian floor, expecting the immediate, brutal strike of his wrath. She waited for the fatal blow, for the execution her sister had promised. But the violence never came. Instead, Calin froze completely. The ambient frost violently swirling around his armor suddenly stalled. His broad chest heaved as he caught a sudden, entirely unexpected scent in the frozen air. It was a warm, sun-infused scent sweet like honeyed wine and summer fire, utterly out of place in his frozen wasteland. The terrifying, cursed monarch looked down and finally saw the trembling, tattered servant girl hiding in his shadows. His storm-grey eyes shifted rapidly to a burning, molten gold. The violent elemental ice that constantly punished his soul began to melt the exact moment he realized who was sitting on his floor. Seren braced for her death, but then she felt the impossible, radiating heat. The Alpha King did not draw his blade. Instead, he dropped heavily to his knees on the freezing stone right in front of her. With agonizing, desperate gentleness, he unclasped his heavy, fur-lined cloak, deeply scented with winter pine and raw, protective authority, and wrapped it carefully around her shivering shoulders. Her crescent-claiming mark flared with a blinding, golden heat, resonating with the absolute, unquestionable truth. He was not going to execute her. He had finally found his fated mate. The heavy, fur-lined garment was a suffocating weight of absolute safety. The thick, luxurious pelts retained the intense, radiating body heat of the Alpha King, pressing a phantom warmth against her trembling spine that defied the freezing ambient temperature of the room. Seren remained frozen in a tight, defensive ball on the polished obsidian floor, her silver hair spilling in a chaotic halo across the dark, winter-scented collar of the cloak. She could not comprehend the sudden absence of violence. Her entire nervous system was still violently wired for a fatal strike, her muscles locked in a rigid, aching spasm of anticipating agony. The hollow brand marking her inner wrist continued to throb beneath her soot-stained skin, no longer emitting a dull, hollow warning, but rather a violent, rhythmic pulse of molten gold that matched the frantic beating of her heart. The air pressure in the massive sanctuary shifted completely, altering the very atmosphere of the forbidden space. The violent sun, elemental ice that had accompanied his terrifying arrival, the predatory frost that had crawled aggressively up the stone walls and coated the heavy iron tapestries, began to weep. Thick, heavy drops of condensation slid rapidly down the massive arched windows, pooling on the cold stone sills. The brutal, suffocating chill that had been slowly freezing the fluid in her delicate joints evaporated in an instant, replaced by a dense, humid warmth that smelled of crushed cedar, wood smoke, and ancient sovereignty. He was so incredibly close. The sheer physical mass of the man kneeling before her blocked out the dim, pale moonlight filtering through the frosted glass. The cloying, metallic stench of the northern battlefields that clung aggressively to his armor, a grim mixture of spilled blood, trampled mud, and freezing rain, was completely neutralized by her immediate proximity. Her scent was incredibly subtle, but entirely undeniable. It was the rich, intoxicating aroma of sun-baked summer earth, sweet honeyed wine, and the warm, smoky cedar of a hearth fire burning in the dead of winter. It was a scent that the sovereign had agonized over in his darkest, most isolated nights, a phantom fragrance that had haunted his empty bedchamber for years. To finally find the physical source of that scent, hidden away and trembling in the very heart of his own freezing fortress, completely shattered the violent, feral instincts of his beast. She did not look up. She kept her soot-stained face buried deeply against her bruised knees, her split, bleeding fingers clutching the heavy wool edges of the royal cloak as if it were a physical lifeline. She tried to pull her emotional shields back around her shattered mind, tried to find the familiar, protective numbness of her lifelong invisibility, but the sheer gravity of his presence stripped all her defenses away. A sharp, metallic, scraping sound echoed through the oppressive, heavy silence of the chamber. The Alpha King was moving. Seren squeezed her eyes tightly shut, a quiet, ragged breath hitching in her raw throat as she braced for the inevitable pain. She heard the heavy, definitive thud of steel hitting the stone floor. He was deliberately discarding his weapons. He was stripping the spiked, blood-stained iron gauntlets from his massive hands, tossing them carelessly into the dark, shadowed corners of the room. The lethal instruments of his legendary wrath clattered loudly against the obsidian tiles, utterly discarded and forgotten in the overwhelming wake of her hidden soul-solar magic. Then, a bare hand hovered over her trembling form. The heat radiating from his large palm was a stark, visceral sensory contrast to the bitter winter storm raging just outside the castle walls. He did not grab her roughly by the hair. He did not drag her up by the frayed, tattered collar of her servant's dress. Instead, rough, deeply calloused fingers brushed against the trembling curve of her jawline. The touch was agonizingly slow, incredibly gentle, carrying the cautious, breathless reverence of a man discovering a fragile, priceless artifact in a desolate field of ash. "Look at me," a voice rumbled in the dark. The command was not a harsh, barked order from a ruthless military commander demanding absolute obedience. It was a raw, fractured whisper, dragged painfully out of a throat that sounded as though it had not spoken a gentle, tender word in centuries. The deep sound vibrated right through the frozen floorboards, bypassing her ears and resonating directly in the very marrow of her bones. Seren could not disobey the ancient elemental pull of the fated bond. Slowly, agonizingly, she lifted her chin, her neck muscles tight with lingering terror. Her silver eyelashes, still heavily coated in a fine layer of melting white frost, fluttered open. She stared directly into the terrifying face of Calin Valerius. The apex predator of the realm was a staggering portrait of untamed, brutal majesty. His strong, square jaw was covered in dark, battle-rue stubble, his cheekbones sharp and angular beneath the smeared grime and dried blood of his defeated enemies. A jagged, angry red scar slashed across his left temple, a violent, immediate testament to the lethal skirmishes he had just survived at the border. But it was his eyes that stole the very breath from her aching lungs, paralyzing her completely. The frightened scullery maids always whispered about the king's winter storm eyes, how they were flat, dead, and entirely devoid of mercy. How one single look could freeze the blood in a traitor's veins and stop a heart from beating. But the palace whispers were entirely wrong, because the Alpha King had finally discovered the absolute truth in his dark sanctuary, and he was yielding his entire kingdom to what was his. His eyes were not a dead, freezing grey. They were burning, shifting pools of molten gold, glowing with a fierce, possessive reverence that illuminated the shadows of the room. The wild, untamed wolf beneath his skin was pressing right against the surface of his gaze, completely and utterly captivated by the fragile, broken woman trembling in his immense shadow. "You are freezing," the sovereign murmured, his golden eyes meticulously tracking the violent, uncontrollable shudders racking her small, severely undernourished frame. His intense gaze dropped to her lips, which were cracked, blistered by the extreme cold, and stained with the sharp copper of her own blood. A sudden flash of pure, unadulterated agony crossed his ruthless features. The grueling, agonizing physical labor in the lower kitchens had already pushed her fragile body to the absolute brink of exhaustion, but the extreme, predatory cold of his unlit sanctuary had driven the frost deep into her marrow. The visible sight of her deep physical suffering seemed to inflict a literal, somatic wound upon his massive chest, causing his breathing to turn ragged and shallow. Before she could form a single coherent word of protest or stammer an apology for defiling his space, Calin shifted his considerable weight. He slid one massive, bare arm securely behind her trembling shoulders and the other smoothly beneath the backs of her bruised bare knees. "No," she gasped out, a quiet, broken sound of pure, unadulterated panic, the lifelong survival instinct to remain small, to avoid the violent wrath of the high-status nobility at all costs, flared fiercely in her chest. "Please, I shouldn't be here. The iron doors, the lock was turned from the outside. I swear I did not mean to intrude." "Hush, my beautiful one," he interrupted immediately. his tone laced with a thick, intoxicating reassurance that completely drowned out her fear. "You are exactly where you are meant to be. You are safe. You are finally safe." With effortless, terrifying physical strength, he lifted her entirely from the freezing obsidian floor. Seren gasped, instinctively grabbing tight handfuls of his dark, sweat-dampened combat tunic to steady her spinning head. The sudden elevation made the cavernous room tilt dangerously, but the absolute, unquestionable security of his iron hold anchored her to reality. She was entirely engulfed in his massive frame, her small, delicate body cocooned within the heavy fur of his royal cloak, pressed flush against the steady, thundering rhythm of his heart. He did not carry her roughly toward the exits to throw her out to the waiting guards. He did not march her toward the glass windows to hurl her to the jagged, deadly rocks below. Instead, he turned his broad back on the corridor entirely, dismissing the outside world as if it no longer existed. The intricate, silver runes etched into the dark steel of his chest plate were originally meant to deflect enemy blades and channel his freezing elemental magic. Now, however, the ancient symbols seemed to glow with a faint, sympathetic warmth as they absorbed the residual heat of her solar lineage. For the first time in the long, bloody history of Thornmere, the devastating ice of the royal bloodline was actively harmonizing with the forbidden fire of a sun-born heir, creating an entirely new, deeply stabilizing atmosphere within the sanctuary. The Alpha King carried his newly discovered fated mate across the vast, cavernous expanse of the room. His heavy, armored boots made absolutely no sound on the thick rugs as he deliberately bypassed the massive four-poster bed draped in dark, heavy velvet. Instead, he moved with steady purpose toward the colossal stone hearth that dominated the western wall. The fireplace was large enough to roast an entire stag, its heavy iron grates cold, dark, and smelling of old soot and long-dead ash. He knelt once again, this time descending onto the incredibly thick, woven bearskin rug that lay before the empty hearth. However, he did not set her down on the floor. He settled back deeply on his heels, keeping her securely and protectively cradled in his lap. The sheer intimacy of the position was overwhelming, a complete, shocking violation of the strict, unyielding pack hierarchy that fiercely dictated Omegas must never even make eye contact with an alpha, let alone rest against their chest in the private royal quarters. "I will not hurt you," he promised, his voice a low, soothing vibration that rumbled pleasantly against her ear, sending a wave of relaxing warmth down her rigid spine. "I swear it on my beast, on my crown, on my very life. I will never let the bitter cold touch you again." Callan raised his large, free hand toward the dark, empty hearth. He did not call for a terrified servant to bring kindling. He did not strike a piece of flint. The sovereign possessed ancient, terrifying elemental magic, though it was historically a brutal magic of deep frost and violent, unforgiving blizzards. But tonight, as his glowing golden eyes remained locked entirely on the burning crescent mark on her small wrist, a vastly different kind of energy surged violently through the room. A spark of raw, crackling blue energy leaped instantly from his extended fingertips, striking the massive dry logs stacked meticulously in the iron grate. The wood instantly erupted into a massive, roaring blaze of blinding light and heat. The sudden, intense influx of thermal warmth chased the oppressive, clinging shadows aggressively back into the far corners of the sanctuary, fully illuminating the stark, heartbreaking contrast between the two figures sitting on the rug. As the massive logs snapped and popped, a profound, lingering silence settled over the cavernous chamber. It was not the oppressive, terrifying silence of a predator stalking its prey, but rather the quiet, domestic peace of a sanctuary that had finally been made whole. Sahazan stared blankly at the dancing orange flames, her mind struggling to process the staggering reality of her situation. She was a soot-stained Omega, a rejected half-blood whose very existence was considered a stain on her noble family's honor. Yet here she was, resting securely against the broad, muscular chest of the most feared ruler in 3 realms, while he meticulously inspected her injuries with the focus of a master healer. The bright firelight danced softly across her pale cheeks, highlighting the deep, exhausted hollows beneath her wide, silver eyes. She was fading rapidly, like a candle running out of wax, entirely depleted by a cruel kingdom that ruthlessly demanded her labor while denying her basic humanity. Callan stared at her with an unblinking intensity. The mighty commander was analyzing every single bruise, every split, bleeding callus on her raw fingers, every fraying, pathetic thread on her threadbare wool dress. The devastating realization of exactly what she had endured under his own roof seemed to physically break the ancient sovereign, the mighty, untouchable commander who flawlessly directed 10,000 lethal warriors without a second of hesitation, was actively trembling as he held her. As they sat bathed in the glorious, radiating heat of the fire, the somatic connection of their fated bond began to aggressively mend the damage the freezing room had inflicted. The golden, molten heat buried deep within the outcast's hidden solar lineage flared up to meet the protective warmth of his body. The half-moon stigma etched onto her skin throbbed with a steady, synchronized rhythm with his racing pulse. For the first time in her miserable, isolated life, the void inside her chest, the hollow absence where her magic had been suppressed and locked away, was flooded with absolute, unconditional acceptance. She did not complain about her lingering pain. She did not beg for his mercy. She simply sat perfectly still, allowing the miraculous, thawing heat of his presence to melt the icy terror that had gripped her soul. "Who did this to you?" he demanded softly, though the quiet question carried the dark, rumbling promise of absolute, unmitigated slaughter. His large thumb gently, carefully brushed a thick smudge of dark, greasy ash from her cheekbone, his touch as light as a falling feather. "Who dared to lock you in the dark?" Seren swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly in the otherwise quiet room. The warmth of the fire was seeping deeply into her bones, slowing the violent, exhausting tremors, but the sheer, undeniable proximity to his raw power was overwhelming her senses. "My sister," she whispered, the dangerous truth slipping past her heavily guarded emotional shields before she could stop it. "Lady Freya. She gave me a missive for the elders, and then she pushed me inside. She used the obsidian key to seal the doors." The name dropped into the quiet space between them like a heavy, blood-stained stone cast into a still, dark lake. The reaction of the king was instantaneous and terrifying. "Lady Freya," he repeated, the syllables tasting like rancid poison on his tongue. The ambient temperature in the room plummeted drastically for a single microsecond, the roaring fire in the hearth flickering violently as his beast roared furiously against the confines of his human skin. A low, guttural snarl vibrated deep within his massive chest, a sound so primal, so purely dangerous, it made the fine hairs on her arms stand straight up. The dark shadow of the lethal wolf was rising rapidly to the surface, demanding the immediate bloody execution of the one who had dared to threaten its chosen mate. But when he looked back down at her terrified, wide silver eyes, the lethal predator instantly yielded to the devoted protector. The deadly frost receded just as quickly as it had flared, vanishing entirely into the warm air. He forced his violent, murderous instincts into complete, unwavering submission, refusing to let his anger frighten the fragile woman in his arms. Seren didn't know that the powerful man kneeling gently on the hearth rug had buried entire rival bloodlines who dared to cross him. She didn't know the vast capacity of his legendary, unforgiving cruelty. She only knew the impossible delicate way he cradled her bruised, bleeding hands, treating her as though she were the most precious, sacred vessel in the entire world. "Because when I saw you lying there, broken and abandoned in the freezing dark, something inside me roared that I had to save you, even if saving you destroys everything else I have built," the Alpha King confessed, his voice thick with unshed, agonizing emotion. He bowed his dark, royal head, pressing his forehead gently against the pulsing, golden mark on her wrist, entirely surrendering his sovereignty to an Omega servant. She locked you in this room hoping to make you my victim. Instead, her trap has finally delivered my queen. The echo of his vow lingered heavily in the massive cavernous chamber, a profound declaration that completely fundamentally altered the reality of the freezing sanctuary. Kaelin slowly withdrew his forehead from hers, his burning golden eyes locking onto her bruised, trembling form with a fierce, unwavering devotion. He shifted his considerable weight backward, gently lifting her from his armored lap, just enough to set her safely on the thickest, softest part of the woven bearskin rug. The heavy, winter-scented, fur-lined cloak settled securely around her small shoulders, creating an impenetrable fortress of radiating warmth that shielded her from the residual chill of the obsidian floor. The Alpha King rose to his feet in a fluid, silent motion that belied his massive, intimidating frame. He did not call out for the royal physicians who slept in the lower wings. He did not summon a terrified servant to tend to the mess. Instead, he walked deliberately toward a heavy oak cabinet positioned near the grand stone hearth. The brass hinges made a soft, muted sound as he opened the doors, his broad back entirely turned to her in a display of absolute, unshakable trust. When he returned to the roaring fire, he carried a small, polished wooden chest. He knelt once more on the rug, placing the medical supplies carefully onto the warm stones of the hearth. Inside the chest were meticulously rolled lengths of pristine white linen, a small silver basin, a flask of clean water, and a heavy glass jar filled with a thick amber-colored balm. Kaelin poured the water into the basin. He did not use his elemental magic to heat it. Instead, he simply pressed his large, collused palms against the silver metal, allowing his own immense body heat to transfer rapidly into the water until it steamed slightly in the cool air. He reached for her hands. Seren flinched purely on a deeply ingrained survival instinct, a quiet breath hitching in her raw, aching throat, but his grip was impossibly gentle. His large, battle-scarred fingers cradled her split, bleeding calluses as if they were made of the finest, most delicate spun glass. He dipped a soft cloth into the warm water and began to carefully wash the dark, greasy ash and dried blood from her raw skin. The physical sensation of being cared for was entirely alien to the outcast. For years, she had scrubbed the Loiter kitchens until her skin cracked and bled, binding her own injuries in the stifling dark with stolen, dirty scraps of frayed wool. She had endured the stinging, relentless pain in complete silence, accepting it as the unavoidable, permanent cost of her low-born existence. She had been taught that her suffering did not matter, that her body was merely a tool meant to be used up and discarded by the noble house. Now the most powerful, feared ruler in 3 realms was meticulously cleaning her wounds, his golden eyes tracking every wince and adjusting his touch to ensure he caused her absolutely no pain. As the warm water washed away the grime, the true extent of the damage became visible. Her knuckles were heavily bruised from her frantic, desperate attempts to break the iron-barred windows. The tips of her delicate fingers carried the dangerous, pale blue tint of early frostbite, a direct result of the predatory cold that had nearly claimed her life in the unlit room. Kaelin stared at the blue marks, his strong jaw clenching so tightly that a muscle ticked wildly in his cheek. As he continued to hold her hands, a profound somatic reaction began to take place. The crescent claiming mark on her inner wrist throbbed with a steady, rhythmic pulse, no longer a dull ache of warning, but a vibrant, living connection. The golden heat of her hidden solar lineage was rushing violently to the surface, responding eagerly to the absolute, unconditional safety radiating from the sovereign. The mark began to glow, casting a faint, warm light across the clean linen bandages resting on his knee. Kaelin stopped washing her skin and gently traced the edge of the glowing, crescent symbol with his thumb. The hollow mark doesn't just contain your power, it creates a void, an absence where your magic should be, the sovereign murmured, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that resonated perfectly with the frantic beating of her heart. Your mother hid your nature incredibly well to keep you alive in a kingdom that fears the light, but the suppression has been starving your soul. It is exactly why the magical frost of this fortress nearly stopped your heart tonight. You have been carrying an empty, hollow vessel your entire life, waiting in the freezing dark for the spark that would finally ignite it. He opened the heavy glass jar, and the rich, intoxicating scent of the amber balm filled the intimate space between them. It smelled strongly of crushed mint, warm honey, and ancient, soothing forest roots. He scooped a small amount of the thick salve onto his fingertips and began to massage it slowly into the split, bleeding skin of her knuckles. The medicine brought an immediate, miraculous relief, a deep, penetrating warmth that aggressively pulled the lingering frostbite completely out of her joints. "I did not know," the Omega whispered, her wide silver eyes entirely captivated by the sight of his dark head bowed in absolute submission over her hands. "I thought I was just defective. My wolf never came. I thought I was broken. You are the only perfect, flawless thing in this entire cursed kingdom," Callan replied fiercely, never looking away from his meticulous task. He began to wrap the clean, pristine white linen around her fingers, binding the deep wounds with practiced, military precision. "For 3 long, agonizing years, I have been losing my mind. Every single night, when the violent ice of my ancestral curse threatened to freeze my heart completely, I would fall into a restless, suffocating sleep, and in those dreams I smelled you." Seren stared at him, her chest tightening with an overwhelming, breathless ache that had absolutely nothing to do with the cold. "I smelled summer earth," the Alpha King continued, his tone thick with a raw, devastating vulnerability that stripped away every terrifying legend she had ever heard about him. "I smelled sweet honeyed wine and the warm, smoky cedar of a safe hearth fire. I woke up tearing my own bedchambers apart, shattering the glass and destroying the furniture, desperately searching for the source of that warmth. I sent my elite trackers across the treacherous northern territories. I ruthlessly interrogated the border patrols. I scoured the high-ranking noble houses, searching for a woman who carried the scent of the sun." He finished tying the soft linen bandages, letting his large, calloused hands entirely envelop her small, wrapped fists, transferring the last necessary surge of his own body heat directly into her recovering veins. "I thought I was going entirely mad," the wolf confessed, his burning golden eyes finally rising to meet her stunned silver gaze. "I thought the ancestors were torturing me with a phantom mate I would never be allowed to find. I did not know you were hiding right beneath my feet, buried in the toxic ash of my own kitchens, working until your delicate hands bled for a family that despised you. If I had known, if I had caught even the faintest trace of your scent in those halls, I would have torn the very stone foundations of this castle apart with my bare hands to unearth you." The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of his absolute devotion crashed over her, systematically washing away the decades of enforced invisibility and cruel neglect. She had spent her entire existence genuinely believing she was entirely unlovable, a disposable, low-born pawn meant to be stepped on by the high-status nobility. But she was wrong. Because the Alpha King had finally discovered the truth, and he was coming for what was his. She was the missing, vital piece of a sovereign's fractured soul. Her quiet, resilient, unacknowledged existence had been the only thing keeping the beast of the north anchored to his humanity while he fought a losing battle against his own cursed bloodline. Outside the reinforced, heavily frosted glass of the massive arched windows, the winter storm suddenly escalated into a violent, screaming blizzard. The howling wind battered the ancient granite walls of the fortress, rattling the heavy, wrought-iron window frames like a desperate, starving predator trying to claw its way inside. The temperature beyond the glass was lethal, dropping to a level that would freeze a man solid in minutes. But within the royal sanctuary, The roaring hearth fire cast long, dancing shadows across the polished obsidian floor, creating an impenetrable, radiant sphere of domestic safety that the storm could not touch. Kalen shifted his position on the thick rug, pulling her slightly closer so that her side rested firmly against his thigh. He needed to keep her completely enveloped in his radiant aura. As he looked toward the locked iron doors, the tender, vulnerable expression on his battle-scarred face slowly hardened, seamlessly replaced by the grim, calculating, and ruthless focus of a military commander preparing for an unavoidable war. The thick, iron-bound portals of this chamber were not designed to keep assassins out, the Sovereign stated quietly, his gaze entirely fixed on the dark metal entrance. They were explicitly designed to lock me in. The obsidian key your sister used tonight is a sacred, dangerous relic from the First Age, forged by the original architects of Thornmere. It was meant to permanently contain the violent outbursts of the Valerius bloodline when the elemental ice curse became too feral, too predatory to control. It creates a magical vacuum that no physical force can break from the inside. Seren shuddered violently, pulling the thick collar of the fur-lined cloak tighter around her small neck. The true implications of the trap were far more sinister, far more calculated than she had initially realized in her panic. Freya had not merely locked her in a random room to freeze. The manipulative noblewoman had deliberately sealed her inside an inescapable magical vault with a cursed apex predator, entirely assuming the king would be consumed by exhaustion and madness, slaughtering whatever unfortunate creature was trapped inside the cage with him. The high-ranking families of this court are a toxic nest of vipers, Cullen continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal register that made the ambient shadows in the rooms seemingly shrink away from him. For years, the ruling elders have desperately tried to control my throne. Elder Brahman and his traditionalist loyalists absolutely despise my refusal to take a high-born, politically advantageous bride. They want a puppet queen. They have sent countless noble daughters to this very room under the guise of diplomatic offerings, hoping to secure their dynastic influence by putting a loyal spy in my bed. He reached out, his large hand incredibly gentle as he tucked a stray, soot-streaked lock of silver hair behind her ear. His delicate touch was a stark, jarring contrast to the dark, violent political history he was systematically recounting. Every single one of them was a calculated, treacherous manipulation, he explained, his golden eyes narrowing with profound disgust. They wore incredibly sweet perfumes that entirely failed to mask the foul scent of their ambition. They smiled with painted lips while carrying concealed silver daggers in their garters, or they attempted to slip heavy sleeping draughts into my wine. They tried to use dark, elemental artifacts to forcibly bind my will to their family banners. I cast every single one of them out before the midnight bells tolled. I threw them back into the freezing corridors and locked the doors permanently against them. No woman lasted a night with him, they had whispered, but one woman did. One woman lasted a lifetime. The terrifying rumors that circulated constantly through the fearful servants' quarters suddenly shattered in Seren's mind, revealing a deeply tragic, lonely truth. The Alpha King was not a mindless, cruel monster who tortured innocent brides for his own twisted amusement. He was a fiercely guarded, exhausted sovereign, relentlessly defending his own physical autonomy and pack security against a deeply corrupt, ambitious court. He had violently banished the high-status noble women because he absolutely refused to accept a transactional, loveless, and dangerous bond. He had been waiting in the freezing dark of his fortress, fiercely preserving his soul and his throne for the one true mate who actually belonged to him. Because monsters do not kneel to speak to children. Because monsters do not search for a year. Because monsters do not look at me the way you do. The realization settled deeply into her aching chest, bringing a profound, unshakable peace that entirely replaced her lifelong anxiety. The outcast Omega no longer saw a terrifying, unpredictable beast sitting beside her on the rug. She saw a lonely, fiercely protective man who desperately needed the exact, quiet, healing warmth she had spent her entire miserable life actively hiding from the world. Your sister Freya knew exactly what she was doing when she handed you that forged missive, Kaelin growled, a faint, dangerous trace of frost leaking into the warm, cedar-scented air as his absolute fury simmered just beneath the surface of his skin. She orchestrated a flawless, untraceable assassination, utilizing the archaic laws of the royal sanctuary to keep her own perfectly manicured hands clean of your blood. She expects to return tomorrow morning with the council elders, unlock the iron doors with the obsidian key, and find your frozen, broken body lying on my floor. She expects to use your tragic death as absolute proof of my feral instability, elevating her own social status as the grieving, noble sibling who must step up to guide the pack. Seren's stared at the locked gateway, the haunting memory of her sister's malicious laughter still echoing faintly in the back of her mind. The crippling fear that had relentlessly ruled her entire existence tried again. A familiar, conditioned panic that warned her to run, to hide, to make herself invisible before the elite nobility could crush her. But before the anxiety could take root in her healing heart, a massive, warm hand completely enveloped hers, anchoring her instantly to the present. "You will not leave this spot," Kaelin commanded softly, though there was no arrogance or tyranny in his tone, only the absolute, unyielding promise of a sovereign's protection. "I am placing this entire chamber under full lockdown. The elemental wards will hold until dawn. You will rest by this fire. You will sleep safely in my cloak, and you will heal, and you will not spend a single second fearing the morning." He leaned forward, pressing a deep, lingering kiss to the center of her forehead. The intimate somatic contact sent a massive rush of pure, restorative golden energy racing straight down her spine, entirely severing the last lingering, toxic threads of her lifelong terror. The void inside her chest overflowed with blinding, undeniable light. "Let them come," the king whispered fiercely against her skin, his tempest-colored gaze glowing with the dark, heavy promise of absolute, inescapable retribution. "Let Lady Freya and Elder Bramman open that door. I want them to see exactly what they have done. I want them to realize that the brutal trap they set to destroy you has only succeeded in handing you my crown. Tomorrow, the entire kingdom will learn exactly what happens when they dare to touch my queen." The violent, screaming blizzard that had relentlessly battered the ancient, towering granite walls of Thornmere finally exhausted itself just before dawn. In its wake, a stark, blindingly bright winter morning emerged, silencing the howl of the winds that had plagued the kingdom for weeks. The pale, crisp sunlight pierced through the thick, frost-rimed glass of the massive arched windows, casting long, fractured prisms of brilliant light across the polished obsidian floor of the royal sanctuary. The oppressive, terrifying darkness of the previous night had been entirely banished. It was replaced by a profound, unshakable tranquility that fundamentally altered the cavernous space. The heavy, lingering scent of ancient stone and deep winter frost was slowly being overpowered by the rich, soothing aroma of burning cedar and sweet honey from the massive hearth. Seren Vantrell sat perfectly still on the edge of a grand, velvet-upholstered settee positioned near the roaring stone fireplace. She was still cocooned deeply within the Alpha King's heavy, winter-scented fur-lined cloak. The luxurious pelt swallowed her small, fragile frame, offering a physical cocoon of absolute safety that she had never known. Her delicate, frost-bitten fingers remained carefully wrapped in the pristine white linen Kalin had meticulously applied hours ago. The deep, penetrating heat of the amber balm continued to pulse through her veins, a constant, somatic reminder that she had miraculously survived the lethal cold that was meant to be her tomb. For the first time in her entire miserable, invisible existence, the hollow void inside her chest was completely quiet. It was no longer a chasm of fear, but a vessel filled instead with the steady, radiant golden warmth of her awakened crescent, claiming mark, throbbing gently in perfect rhythm with the Alpha King's heartbeat. Calin Valerius stood a few paces away, his massive, intimidating back turned to the heavy iron doors that sealed them from the treacherous world outside. The dreaded ruler had discarded his blood-stained battle armor completely, leaving the heavy steel plates stacked neatly near the armory rack. He was now dressed in fresh, dark leather and a simple, finely woven black tunic that stretched tight across his broad, heavily scarred shoulders. He was engaged in an incredibly mundane, domestic task that fiercely contradicted every terrifying legend ever told about him by the whispering courtiers. The sovereign was quietly, patiently pouring a steaming, fragrant blend of crushed cedar and dried winter berries into a delicate silver teacup. The elemental wards he had cast the night before still hummed faintly in the air. This microscopic, protective vibration kept the ambient temperature of the sanctuary perfectly, impossibly warm, shielding his fragile mate from the biting winter outside. The profound domestic peace was abruptly shattered by the harsh, echoing sound of heavy footsteps marching aggressively down the freezing stone corridor outside. The dense granite walls of the upper tower were incredibly thick, designed to withstand sieges and elemental fury, but the heightened, predatory senses of the fated mate bond allowed the outcast to hear the approaching assembly with terrifying magnified clarity. Her silver eyes widened slightly, a brief, conditioned spike of ancestral anxiety fluttering violently in her chest. For years, the sound of approaching boots had only ever meant pain, punishment, or further humiliation. She instinctively tightened her bandaged hands around the thick, comforting edges of the royal garment, pulling Kaelin's scent closer to her face to ground her racing pulse. The Alpha King did not turn around immediately. He did not flinch, nor did his broad shoulders tense with the instinct for war. He simply finished pouring the hot tea, his movements steady, deliberate, and completely unbothered by the impending intrusion. He crossed the thick bearskin rug with silent, predatory grace and gently pressed the warm silver saucer into her trembling palms. His massive calloused hands lingered for a fraction of a second over her bandaged fingers, transferring a wave of grounding, elemental heat directly into her skin. "Drink," the sovereign commanded softly, his flinty irises meeting hers with absolute, unwavering confidence. "Let the poison reveal itself outside our door, Seren. You have absolutely nothing left to fear from their venom. Today, the shadows that have haunted you will be dragged into the light and burned to ash." Through the heavy, ice-rimed metal of the entrance, the sharp, highly theatrical sound of a woman weeping aggressively pierced the morning silence. It was a masterful, highly calculated performance of absolute, manufactured despair designed to manipulate the rigid laws of the pack hierarchy. "Elder Brahman, please, we must hurry," Freya Vantrell cried out, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceilings of the hallway. The cloying, expensive scent of her sweet gardenia perfume seeped insidiously beneath the door gap. It provided a sharp, artificial contrast to the genuine, smoky warmth of the sanctuary. I found her cleaning bucket and coarse brushes abandoned on the lower landing of the forbidden stairs. My foolish, defective sister. She has always been so terribly confused in the head. She must have wandered up to this wing in a blind delusion. If she has disturbed the king, we must retrieve her before it is too late. "Control yourself, Lady Freya," the harsh, rigid voice of Bramon Kael snapped in response. The strict council elder struck the base of his heavy wooden staff violently against the floorboards, emphasizing his unyielding authority and traditionalist worldview. "If the Omega has intentionally breached the royal sanctuary, there will be absolutely nothing left for your noble house to save. The laws of this pack are ancient and unforgiving. The Alpha King returned from the northern front last night in a highly feral state, his beast demanding blood. Any unauthorized trespassing into his private den is an immediate, indisputable death sentence. Your sister's foolishness has sealed her own fate." "Stand back, both of you," a new, deeper voice interrupted, carrying the heavy weight of absolute military discipline. It was Garrick Stone, the stoic, fiercely loyal royal guard who served directly under the sovereign. The heavy clanking of his thick iron chainmail signaled his tactical positioning before the entrance. The king's beast will be intensely territorial if he has claimed a fresh kill in his den. I have brought the heavy suppression chains just in case his human mind has not yet resurfaced from the carnage. Prepare yourselves for the worst. The cleanup will be exceptionally gruesome, and I will not risk the elders' safety if the sovereign is still blinded by his ancestral curse. Sitting securely by the roaring fire, the silver-haired maid listened to her half-sister systematically build a flawless, impenetrable lie. The noblewoman was establishing a perfect, airtight alibi, framing the brutal, premeditated assassination attempt as a tragic, accidental wandering by a low-status, mentally unstable servant. The sheer calculating malice of the plot was breathtaking in its cruelty. In the past, hearing such a perfectly orchestrated condemnation would have crushed the Omega's spirit entirely Kaya, sending her spiraling into a paralyzing, desolate despair from which she could never recover. But as she took a slow, grounding sip of the hot cedar tea, feeling the warmth spread through her chest, a profound realization settled over her. "Thank you for letting me go," she thought quietly, staring into the dancing orange flames that mirrored the gold in her soul, because being let go had allowed her to be found by a better man, a better kingdom, a better life, and she would never, ever look back. The terrifying monsters of her past were currently standing on the wrong side of a locked portal. They were completely unaware that the fragile prey they intended to bury had just become their sovereign ruler. A girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced because she was never there to begin with. She mused, but today she would be seen by the entire realm. "I brought the master artifact from the Elder's vault," the weeping liar continued outside, her tones trembling with fake, manufactured hesitation that masked a deeply sadistic anticipation. "The obsidian key. We must open the door and retrieve whatever is left of her remains, Elder. We cannot allow her low-born blood to permanently defile the king's private sanctuary." A heavy, metallic grinding echoed loudly as the ancient, black stone relic was forcefully shoved into the locking mechanism of the massive doors. The complex tumblers inside the thick steel groaned in violent protest against the intrusion. The faint, humming vibration of Kalin's elemental wards instantly dissipated, shattering like fine glass as the archaic magic of the master key dismantled the defensive barrier from the outside. The imposing steel entry swung inward with a slow, agonizing creak pushed violently open by the armored shoulder of the royal guard. A sudden, violent gust of freezing hallway air rushed into the room, carrying the bitter, biting chill of the outer corridors and the sickeningly sweet stench of gardenia perfume. The assembly halted dead in their tracks on the threshold, completely paralyzed by the sight before them. Freya, Bramon, and Garrick had braced their stomachs for a horrifying, blood-soaked massacre. They had fully expected to find the cavernous room completely destroyed, the heavy velvet tapestries shredded by feral claws, the obsidian floor slick with crimson blood, and the mangled, frozen corpse of an arrogant servant discarded carelessly in the corner like trash. Instead, they stepped into a sphere of intoxicating, deeply restorative peace that defied all logic. The vast chamber was immaculate, entirely untouched by violence or madness. The massive stone hearth was roaring with a bright, welcoming fire that cast a warm, golden glow over the expensive furnishings. The air did not smell of death, raw copper, or feral ice. It smelled richly of sweet honeyed wine, summer earth, and absolute, undeniable safety. And sitting directly in the center of the room, resting comfortably on the royal settee with a delicate silver teacup, balanced gracefully in her lap, was Seren. She was completely unharmed. Her silver hair was neatly tucked behind her ears, catching the bright morning sunlight and framing her face like a celestial halo. The luxurious pelts of the fur-lined cloak draped magnificently over her small frame, serving as a visual, undisputed declaration of the sovereign's ultimate protection. She did not cower as she used to. She did not look at the floor in terrified submission. She simply stared back at the intruders with wide, calm silver eyes, radiating a quiet, ancient dignity that utterly defied her soot-stained origins and lowly station. Directly behind her stood the fearsome beast of the north. The Alpha King was not a mindless, feral monster driven by ancestral madness. He was standing incredibly tall, his broad, powerful hands resting gently, protectively on the high velvet back of Seren's chair, cementing his absolute devotion to her safety. His thunderous stare was fixed entirely on the three people standing frozen in his doorway. His expression was a mask of cold, lethal, terrifying calm that promised unparalleled violence. The sheer, somatic pressure of his unrestrained alpha aura hit the threshold like a physical, crushing tidal wave of dark gravity. It was an overwhelming, suffocating display of absolute dominance that instantly drove the oxygen from the room, pressing down on their lungs and forcing compliance on a fundamental biological level. Garrick Stone, reacting entirely on ingrained military instinct and profound, absolute respect for his sovereign, immediately dropped to one knee. He bowed his head deeply toward the stone floor until his brow nearly touched the obsidian tiles. The stoic warrior recognized instantly that there was no feral beast to subdue, only a fully conscious, supremely powerful monarch fiercely guarding his claimed territory and his chosen mate. Elder Brahman froze completely, his rigid, traditionalist mind utterly failing to process the impossible visual reality standing before him. The strict old wolf's jaw went entirely slack. His heavy wooden staff slipped from his wrinkled, trembling grip to clatter loudly against the floorboards. He stared in absolute, dumbfounded shock at the low-born servant draped casually in the king's sacred mantle, trying to reconcile his knowledge of the pack laws with the undeniable truth of the Alpha's absolute protection. But it was the reaction of the manipulative sister that truly shifted the atmosphere of the sanctuary into a theater of pure horror. Freya's highly theatrical, gasping sobs were abruptly severed, cut off as if an invisible, razor-sharp blade had slashed across her vocal cords. Her perfectly painted lips parted in sheer, unadulterated terror. The flush of fake grief and excitement drained entirely from her beautiful aristocratic face, leaving her skin a sickly, ashen grey. The cloying, sweet scent of her gardenia perfume instantly soured, curdling violently into the pungent, acidic stench of raw, animalistic panic. Her wide, frantic eyes darted desperately from the living, breathing form of the sibling she had cautiously come condemned to die, to the burning, molten gold eyes of the sovereign who was watching her every single move with predatory stillness. "You dare to unlock my sanctuary, Elder Brahman." Kaelin's voice was incredibly quiet, barely rising above the pleasant crackle of the hearth fire. Yet it carried the devastating, bone-rattling resonance of an impending earthquake that threatened to tear the fortress apart. The old council member flinched violently, his knees giving out as he instinctively dropped to the floor beside the royal guard. His voice trembled violently, cracking with absolute fear as he attempted to articulate a pathetic defense. "My king, please forgive the intrusion," Lady Freya alerted the council. She claimed her sister, the Omega, had recklessly trespassed into your private chambers. "We believed your privacy and your sanctuary had been violated." "My privacy was indeed violated," the Alpha King rumbled, stepping slowly, deliberately out from behind the velvet settee. He moved with the terrifying, silent grace of a massive apex predator circling trapped, helpless prey. He completely ignored the kneeling men, his burning golden gaze locking entirely onto the violently trembling noblewoman still standing paralyzed in the doorway. but not by the woman sitting by my fire. Freya took a desperate, unsteady step backward, her expensive leather boots scraping loudly against the stone as her mind fractured. Her chest heaved rapidly, her thoughts frantically searching for a way to salvage her flawless, untraceable assassination plot before it buried her alive. "Alpha, Your Majesty," she stammered, her voice cracking under the crushing, suffocating pressure of his aura. "She is a defective Omega, a liar, a miserable stain on our noble house. She must have sneaked in here too. Do not speak her name with that filthy tongue." Callan snarled, his restraint finally snapping. A sudden, violent flash of elemental frost exploded across the stone walls near the door, instantly sealing the exit and silencing the liar with a shockwave of biting cold. The sheer, directed malice in his tone made the noblewoman whimper pathetically, her knees finally buckling as she collapsed in a heap onto the frozen floorboards, completely devoid of her former arrogance. The sovereign slowly walked back to the settee. His terrifying, lethal demeanor vanished entirely, melting away the exact second he turned his attention back to the fragile woman sitting safely in his cloak. With a gentleness that absolutely stunned the kneeling assembly into further silence, Callan reached down and carefully took Seren's bandaged hand in his massive, battle-scarred palm. He did not demand her obedience. He simply offered his immense strength, a silent vow that she would never be hurt again. He slowly, reverently pushed up the heavy, fur-lined sleeve of the royal garment, exposing her delicate inner wrist to the bright morning light flooding through the windows. For her entire life, the fading lunar shape on her skin had been a hollow, faded scar, a source of endless public humiliation, systemic abuse, and undeniable proof of her supposedly defective nature. But as the Alpha King's thumb gently, intimately brushed the edge of the ancient symbol, the dormant, cosmic magic hidden deeply within her blood reacted violently to her fated mate's touch. The hollow mark doesn't just contain your power, it creates a void, an absence where your magic should be, waiting only for him to unlock it. The mark ignited. It blazed with a blinding, undeniable golden fire, a pure, incandescent solar light that instantly illuminated the darkest corners of the cavernous chamber. The radiant, cosmic energy was so incredibly intense that Elder Bramon had to physically shield his aging eyes with a trembling hand, gasping as the warmth washed over his face. It was a profound, indisputable display of raw elemental power that completely bypassed the rigid, arbitrary social hierarchies of the pack. Sunborn, the old traditionalist, gasped, his voice barely a terrified, awestruck whisper as he stared at the glowing divine seal. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow, shattering decades of rigid pack law. The ancient texts spoke of the legendary celestial lineage, a bloodline of pure, healing fire that was supposed to have been entirely eradicated centuries ago. It was not the mark of a broken, wolfless Omega. It was the sacred, supreme emblem of a true royal vessel, meant to sit beside the king, not beneath him. "She did not sneak into my sanctuary," Callan declared, his voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable sovereignty across the silent room. He kept his large hand wrapped firmly, protectively around hers, publicly cementing their eternal connection before the highest authority of the court. She was trapped here, locked in the freezing dark by a jealous, manipulative coward who used a sacred council relic to orchestrate a premeditated murder. Lady Freya expected my ancestral curse to tear this innocent woman apart while she waited to claim the spoils. The king turned his burning golden eyes back to the sobbing, ruined noblewoman trembling pathetically on the floor. The promise of retribution in his gaze was absolute, a terrifying storm of vengeance offering zero room for mercy, forgiveness, or redemption. But instead of a victim, I found my salvation, the beast of the north proclaimed, the violent ice of his aura melting completely into the warm, protective fire of his mate. I found my Luna, I found my queen, and anyone who has ever dared to cause her a single moment of pain will answer directly to me. Callan's burning golden gaze hardened back into lethal frost as he looked down at the sobbing woman on the floor. Garrick Stone stepped forward. The royal guard immediately rose from his knee, his posture rigid with absolute military precision, completely loyal to his sovereign's judgment. Yes, Alpha. Strip the Vantrell noble house insignia from this traitor's garments, the king commanded coldly, his voice echoing with absolute, unforgiving authority. Lady Freya is hereby stripped of all titles, lands, wealth, and royal privileges. She is no longer of noble blood, and her name will be erased from the high courts. Furthermore, I sentence her to permanent banishment in the freezing border keeps. Freya shrieked, a raw, agonizing sound of absolute devastation as Garrick stepped toward her with grim determination. "No, Callan, please, I am a highborn. You cannot send me to the ice. I will die there. You will survive exactly as long as your malice allows." Callan replied flatly, utterly unmoved by her weeping, standing as an impenetrable shield before his true mate. "Garrick, you will personally oversee her immediate exile. Drag her out of my sight, now." Garrick did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He reached down, violently tearing the silver Vantrell crest from Freya's velvet bodice with a sharp rip of fabric, before hauling the screaming, thrashing woman up forcefully by her arms. Her frantic cries and desperate, ugly sobs echoed off the vaulted ceilings as the guard dragged her ruthlessly from the royal sanctuary. Her boots scraped helplessly against the stone, leaving only a profound, satisfying silence in her wake. Seren did not beg for mercy on her sister's behalf. She simply watched, her heart steady, as the universe finally balanced its scales. The trap had finally snapped shut, but not on the fragile prey it was designed for. As she was hauled away into the freezing dark, Freya Vantrell stared back at the glowing, golden mark of her sister's absolute triumph. She realized with suffocating, paralyzing despair that her own malicious cruelty had just built an untouchable throne for the very outcast she had tried to destroy. The profound, satisfying silence that settled over the royal sanctuary after the guard departed was not the end of the conflict. It was merely the deep, gathering breath before a catastrophic storm. Seren sat perfectly still on the velvet settee, the heavy, winter-scented fur-lined cloak wrapped securely around her fragile shoulders. Her bandaged fingers, still radiating the deep, penetrating heat of the amber balm, rested carefully in her lap. She watched as Callan turned away from the open doorway and walked slowly toward the dark corner of the cavernous room. He knelt on the polished obsidian floor, his massive shoulders shifting under his dark leather tunic, and retrieved the items that had orchestrated the previous night's terror. In his large, battle-scarred hand, the Alpha King handled the treacherous items with the cold, calculating precision of a sovereign preparing for absolute war. When he turned back to face her, his normally tumultuous eyes were entirely calm, yet they burned with a shifting, molten gold intensity that promised unparalleled retribution. He crossed the thick bearskin rug and stopped before her, offering his hand. He did not issue a harsh command or demand her obedience. He simply waited, his immense presence serving as an unshakable anchor against the lifelong anxiety that still fluttered weakly in the back of her mind. Seren looked at his offered palm, took a slow, grounding breath, and placed her small, heavily wrapped hand into his. The sacred solar emblem upon her inner wrist flared instantly, sending a rush of liquid, golden warmth, straight up her arm and into her chest. They left the private sanctuary together, walking slowly down the winding, ancient granite staircases of the forbidden upper tower. The descent was a surreal experience for the outcast. For her entire life, she had scrambled up and down these very steps in terrified silence, keeping her head bowed and her soot-stained presence entirely invisible to avoid the brutal punishments of the elite class. Now she was walking openly through the corridors, securely enveloped in the king's sacred mantle, her hand held firmly in the grip of the most powerful ruler in 3 realms. The ambient temperature in the stone hallways was bitterly cold, the residual elemental ice clinging stubbornly to the masonry, but the freezing air could not touch her. The somatic, radiating heat of their fated bond created an impenetrable sphere of domestic safety that moved with them, pushing the shadows back into the dark corners of the fortress. The great hall of Thornmere was a colossal, cavernous theatre of political ambition and ancestral power, designed to intimidate and overwhelm anyone who stood before the throne. As Callan and his newly discovered mate approached the massive, iron-reinforced oak doors of the assembly room, the heavy, chaotic murmur of hundreds of voices bled through the thick wood. Following the emergency tolling of the iron morning bells, the entire high-born court had been abruptly summoned from their luxurious quarters. The elite wolves of the kingdom were gathered in tight, anxious clusters, draped in exquisite crimson silks, heavy velvets, and pristine white furs. They whispered frantically among themselves, their breath plumbing in thick white clouds in the freezing air, completely unaware of the absolute devastation that was about to descend upon their rigid, toxic hierarchy. Garrick Stone had not dragged the ruined noblewoman directly out into the blinding snow. By the Alpha King's explicit, unyielding command, the loyal guard had hauled his prisoner directly to the center of the great hall to await public judgment. Freya knelt on the cold, unforgiving stone floor, her beautiful, aristocratic face pale and contorted in a mask of absolute, paralyzing terror. She was bound tightly in heavy iron suppression chains, the thick, metallic links clinking sharply with every violent, uncontrollable shudder that racked her body. The expensive gardenia perfume that usually masked her calculated malice had completely soured, replaced by the pungent, undeniable stench of raw, animalistic panic. Elder Bramman stood a few paces away from her, his aged face ashen, and his posture completely stripped of its usual rigid, traditionalist arrogance. In his trembling, wrinkled hands, the old council member held the sacred obsidian key, the ancient artifact, feeling like a cursed heavy weight against his palms. The heavy oak doors at the top of the grand day swung open with a deafening, resounding crash that instantly silenced the chaotic whispers of the assembly. Every single head in the cavernous room snapped upward, their eyes widening in collective, unadulterated shock. They had expected to see their fearsome commander stride into the room alone, radiating feral ice and demanding a brutal military report. Instead, they witnessed a visual reality that fundamentally shattered centuries of established pack law. The Alpha King stood at the top of the stairs, projecting a terrifying, unrestrained sovereign aura that hit the floor like a physical crushing tidal wave of dark gravity. The sheer somatic pressure of his dominance forced the oxygen from the room, driving the elite nobles instinctively to their knees in absolute, unquestionable submission. But it was not the king's lethal presence that completely paralyzed the court. It was the woman standing securely by his side. Seren did not cower. She did not bow her head or try to make herself small, shedding the defensive survival tactics she had utilized her entire life. She stood tall in the bright morning light, filtering through the high clerestory windows, her silver hair catching the pale sun and framing her face like a celestial halo. The thick, luxurious pelts of the royal cloak draped magnificently over her small frame, hiding her threadbare servant's dress, but loudly declaring her untouchable status. Her wide, calm, silver eyes swept over the kneeling masses, processing the staggering reversal of her fate. The high-ranking families who had mocked her, starved her, and treated her as a defective, disposable stain on the kingdom were now entirely bowed at her feet, unable to even meet her gaze. Ruthless tyrants would never yield their fury for just anyone. Savages would never strip their own fortresses bare to build a safe harbor. A true fiend would never look at a broken, invisible girl and see the only light left in the world. Callan guided her slowly down the stone steps of the dais, his movements deliberate and predatory, ensuring that every single member of the court witnessed the absolute reverence with which he treated her. They stopped directly in front of the chained, weeping woman in the center of the room. Freya looked up, her painted lips trembling as she stared at the glowing, golden fire of the crescent claiming mark blazing on her half-sister's exposed wrist. The undeniable, cosmic truth of the sunborn lineage was radiating so intensely that it cast a warm, incandescent light across the freezing floorboards, forcing the surrounding nobles to physically shield their eyes. "Look closely at the ground before you," the sovereign rumbled, his voice low and incredibly dangerous, yet carrying a resonance that echoed flawlessly off the vaulted ceilings. He tossed the forged royal missive onto the stone tiles. The heavy parchment landed with a soft slap, the dark red wax seal staring up at the court like a bloody, undeniable accusation. "This is the toxic, calculated ambition that has rotted at the foundation of my kingdom for years." Lady Freya forged a direct council order to force an innocent woman into my private sanctuary. She intended to use my ancestral curse as a lethal weapon, assuming my beast would blindly slaughter anyone who crossed the threshold. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the kneeling assembly. The high-born families shifted uncomfortably, their expensive silks rustling as they exchanged terrified, desperate glances. The political elite instantly realized they were no longer dealing with a feral, exhausted commander they could quietly manipulate with bribes and sweet smiles. They were facing a fully lucid, violently protective monarch who had finally unearthed the deep, venomous roots of their corruption. She used a sacred council artifact to seal the iron doors from the outside, locking this woman in the freezing dark to die, Kalin continued, his piercing silver gaze sweeping across the trembling crowd, promising absolute slaughter to anyone who dared to speak a word of defense. She expected to return this morning, unlock the vault, and use the tragedy to elevate her own dynastic standing. She believed she could manipulate the throne through the blood of her own bloodline. Freya lunged forward against the heavy iron suppression chains, her expensive leather boots scraping uselessly against the floor. "Please," she shrieked, her voice cracking in a pathetic, delirious plea as she looked desperately toward the other high-ranking families. "Lord Vane, Lady Aris, you know me. I am one of you. You cannot let him do this to a pure blood. I only meant to protect the pack from a defective, useless Omega." Not a single noble moved to help her. The wealthy lords and ladies who had gladly drank her honeyed wine and attended her lavish, exclusive galas now actively turned their faces away, completely abandoning her to the king's wrath. The absolute social isolation was a far more devastating blow to the manipulative matriarch than any physical strike could ever be. Her entire world, built entirely on false prestige and calculated cruelty, crumbled into dust before her eyes. "She is not defective," Elder Brahman spoke up, his harsh voice completely devoid of its usual rigid authority. The old council member stepped forward, his head bowed respectfully as he gestured toward the blinding, golden light radiating from the silver-haired maid's skin. "The mark she bears is the ancient celestial seal of the Sunborn. It is a supreme, healing lineage that predates the founding of this fortress. The Omega is a true royal vessel. She is the only magic capable of breaking the winter curse of the Valerius bloodline. The absolute confirmation from the strictest traditionalist in the realm shattered the final, lingering doubts of the court." The whispers ceased entirely. "The Vantrell name is dead," Kalin pronounced, delivering the final inescapable sentence with the cold, lethal finality of a falling executioner's blade. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Lady Freya is stripped of all rank, all wealth, and all protection under my laws. She is banished permanently to the northern wasteland. If she ever sets foot within the borders of Thornmere again, she will be killed on sight." The sovereign gave a short, sharp nod to his loyal guard. Garrick stepped forward immediately, grabbing the heavy iron chains and hauling the screaming, thrashing woman to her feet. Freya fought wildly, her manicured nails scratching uselessly against the guard's thick steel chainmail, her ugly sobs echoing pitifully through the grand space. Garrick dragged her forcefully toward the massive main gates of the fortress. The heavy wooden barricades were pulled open by the sentries, revealing the blinding, hostile white expanse of the treacherous northern blizzards. With a brutal, efficient shove, the guard threw the ruined noblewoman out into the biting, predatory cold. The massive gates slammed shut behind her with a deafening, vibrating boom that shook the ancient granite walls, dropping a heavy, permanent iron bar across the lock. The trap was completely empty. The kingdom was safe. The absolute uncompromised poetic justice had been served, leaving zero room for redemption or return. Callan turned away from the sealed gates, completely dismissing the ghost of the past. He reached down and gently placed his large, calloused hand on the small of Seren's back, guiding her toward the elevated obsidian throne at the back of the hall. He did not walk ahead of her to claim his seat, while leaving her to stand in his shadow. He walked exactly at her side, matching his long predatory strides to her slow, measured steps. When they reached the top of the dais, the Alpha King did not sit. Instead, he gently turned the former servant around and pressed her down into the heavy, velvet-cushioned seat of the sovereign throne. The moment her body made full contact with the ancient, dark stone of the royal chair, the hollow void inside her chest, the agonizing emptiness that had defined her entire, invisible existence, finally shattered. The spark of golden, molten heat that Callan had nurtured by the hearth fire suddenly erupted into a blinding, magnificent inferno of pure cosmic magic. The divine soul-bond sigil on her wrist flared so brightly it transcended physical light, sending a massive shockwave of warm summer energy exploding outward from the throne. The somatic reaction was instantaneous and world-bending. The golden fire raced rapidly down the stone steps of the dais, spreading across the polished obsidian floorboards like a rushing tide of liquid sunlight. The bitter, residual elemental frost that had plagued the great hall for centuries began to violently weep. Thick, heavy droplets of condensation rolled rapidly down the massive pillars as the freezing, predatory chill evaporated entirely from the air. The heavy, oppressive scent of winter pine and old battle blood was instantly replaced by the overwhelming, intoxicating fragrance of blooming jasmine, sweet honeyed wine, and warm, rain-soaked earth. A collective gasp of absolute awe rose from the kneeling court as the ancient, bitter winter curse of the Valerius bloodline was physically broken before their eyes. Through the high, arched clerestory windows, the blinding morning sunlight intensified. The dead, frozen briars that had choked the castle courtyards for generations suddenly twisted and turned, green, rapidly sprouting vibrant. Golden-petaled flowers that pushed aggressively through the melting snow. The violent, elemental ice that had kept the Alpha King isolated in the dark was completely consumed by the protective, healing fire of his chosen mate. Callan dropped heavily to one knee before the obsidian throne, his dark head bowed in absolute, reverent submission as he took her bandaged hands in his. He pressed a long, devoted kiss to the glowing mark on her wrist, letting the radiant warmth of her solar magic wash entirely over his battle-scarred soul. She looked down at the kneeling immortal, her chest rising and falling with a profound, unshakable peace. She did not need to hide in the shadows anymore. She did not need to be small to survive. She had finally stepped into the blinding light, and she would never, ever look back. The thawing of the northern territories, the elders would recount in hushed, reverent whispers for generations to come, was not brought by the turning of the seasons or the gentle warmth of the spring sun. It was brought by a quiet queen who had survived the freezing dark, and a terrifying king who had finally learned how to yield to the light.